Everybody, welcome. My name is Regina Miller, and I am the Interim Director of the Greenberg Center for Judaic Studies. And I would like to welcome everyone to this first program of Fall 2020, Collaborative Planning of the University of Hartford Maurice Greenberg Center for Judaic Studies and the UConn Center for Judaic Studies and Contemporary Life. Through the benefit of technology, we have a full schedule of a variety of events for you and hope to see you many times during the semester. At this point, I would like to introduce Dr. Avi Pat from UConn. Avi?
Thank you. Thank you so much for the introduction, Regina. And I'm delighted to be here and offer words of welcome on behalf of the University of Connecticut Center for Judaic Studies and Contemporary Jewish Life, where I am the director and also the Doris and Simon Conover Chair of Judaic Studies. And I'm really excited to begin this year, really a year of virtual programming with Derek Penslar, who will be speaking on this wonderful new book, which Regina will introduce in a moment. But I'm also excited because, as many of you know, this is an opportunity for us to launch all kinds of virtual partnerships. And this is the beginning of a partnership between the Maurice Greenberg Center for Judaic Studies and the UConn Center for Judaic Studies, where we'll be able to bring wonderful scholars to our community here in Greater Hartford and throughout the state of Connecticut. And this is just the first of many upcoming programs, including a program this Monday evening with Anna Sternschitz and Soy Korolenko on Yiddish Glory, which should be wonderful. And September 30th, we're going to have another program, which will be a virtual book launch on understanding and teaching the Holocaust, a new volume of which I am a co-editor. I also want to mention and give a special welcome to a number of my students from the University of Connecticut who are taking a class with me this semester, both in person and virtually, that is called Israel, History and Society. And we just spent the week talking about Der Judenstaat, the Jewish state, and talking about the First Zionist Congress. So we may have some good questions about Theodor Herzl coming your way. And that's also just a reminder about the mechanics of the meeting. Regina, if you were going to say this, or I can.
Go right ahead.
You'll notice that WebEx functions very similarly to Zoom. So there is both a chat and a Q&A function that you can use as Professor Penslar is speaking to ask questions, and the hosts or the panelists or Professor Penslar will also be able to see them, and we'll be able to respond to the questions after his presentation. So you can type them and make sure that you direct your questions to everyone so that all can see your questions in case they have a similar question. So it's wonderful to welcome all of you here this evening. In case I don't have an opportunity to do so, I just want to wish everyone a Shana Tova Umetuka and a Shana Shel Briut, a happy and a healthy new year to everyone. Regina.
Okay. So this evening's program is being brought to you through funding from the Rose and Arthur Fallman Fund at the Maurice Greenberg Center for Judaic Studies at the University of Hartford. Ruth Yankovich, who is in the audience, I'm assuming, and her sister Penny May, who are with us this evening, are the daughters of Rose and Arthur Fallman of blessed memory. The Fallmans were both born in Europe, Mr. Fallman in Molheim on the Ruhr, Germany, in the 1910s, and Mrs. Fallman in Vienna in the 1920s. They both were fortunate to escape Europe with their families in 1938-39 and settled in New York. They met in New York City, married, and moved to West Hartford from New York in the late 1940s and remained in West Hartford for the remainder of their lives. Mr. Fallman built a successful medical lab, and Mrs. Fallman was a devoted mother and wonderful pianist. Several years before they passed away, 1998-99, they created at the Greenberg Center an annual lecture, the Fallman Lecture on German Jewish Culture. Throughout his life, Mr. Fallman read a great deal of Jewish history from Josephus on, and a lot of particularly German Jewish writers. Mrs. Fallman enjoyed reading books of modern Jewish history and fiction. Since their passing, Ruth and Penny have tried to keep their parents' interest in German Jewish history and culture alive with continuing programs at the Greenberg Center. And this year, they're very much looking forward to hearing Professor Derek Penslar, Harvard Professor of Jewish History. So now I would like to talk a little bit about Dr. Penslar. He's the William Lee Forrest Professor of Jewish History at Harvard University. His work encompasses the history of the Jews in modern West and Central Europe, North America, and Israel. He's particularly interested in the relation between modern Israel, diaspora Jewish societies, and global nationalist movements. Dr. Penslar has taught at Indiana University, Bloomington, the University of Toronto, and Oxford University, where he served as the inaugural Stanley Lewis Professor of Modern Israel Studies from 2012 until 2016. He's the president of the American Academy for Jewish Research and a fellow of the Royal Society of Canada. Dr. Penslar is the author or editor of 10 books, most recently Jews in the Military, A History, which was published in 2013, and Theodor Herzl, The Charismatic Leader, which was published in 2020. He is currently writing a book titled Zionism, An Emotional State, and is beginning work on a global history of the 1948 Middle East War. We are thrilled that Dr. Penslar is with us this evening and look forward to his presentation. Dr. Penslar, the square rectangle, usually you say the floor is yours, but it's all yours.
The square is mine. Thank you. Can you hear me all right? Is the sound all right?
Right, it does.
Okay, good. Well, thank you, Regina, and thank you, Avi. Thank you for the kind introduction. Thank you for the kind invitation. I wish I were there in person for all kinds of reasons, but I'm glad to be able to share some things with you from my book and some broader questions behind the book. I'm still working on Zoom and WebEx teaching technology or speaking technology, so hopefully this will all go well, but I beg your patience in case we have a couple of glitches. The first thing I'm going to try to do is share my screen because I have a PowerPoint presentation, and what I'm going to be doing is just basically talking. I don't have a formal, I'm not going to be reading a talk or anything like that, because one thing I've learned in the age of Zoom is don't do that. But I want to build my talk around what I hope you'll find to be arresting images with explanations that I will make clear. So I'm going to share content. What's interesting is, where's the PowerPoint presentation? Do you see the PowerPoint presentation? Okay, yeah. And you can still hear me. Okay, now I know that to see you most clearly, I should be looking at a little green dot right at the top of my screen, which looks like something from the film 2001: A Space Odyssey. And I'll try to do that. It is also a bit off, I mean, it's a bit odd, as anyone who's done this kind of teaching can tell you, or speaking, not to see faces, you know, that I'm just talking into a void. But the fact is I do see Regina over there. So it's like a little humanity. So it's fantastic. But I know there's a lot of people out there, and I'm really glad that you've chosen to join us this evening. And as you can see, although the talk is about Herzl, I'm putting Herzl in a bigger perspective, going back to Moses here, of what makes a great Jewish leader. Because the book is a biography of Herzl, but it's really a study in leadership, what it means to be a leader, and particularly what it means to be a Jewish leader. So let me just begin with some introductory comments about that, and then we'll get into Herzl. But first, just a few bits of introduction. First of all, traditional Jewish leadership. What does it mean to be a leader? I mean, in the Jewish community as opposed to in the world as a whole. Throughout most of human history, to be a leader means to be a person possessed of political power, which could mean some sort of a monarch, a lord, an aristocrat. In a democratic society or in a republic, it's someone who is elected. It could be a tyrant or a dictator. There's many different forms of that kind of political power. Military power and political power are very closely linked. Well, you know, Jewish civilization throughout most of its history hasn't featured that kind of power. The most influential figures in thousands of years of Jewish civilization were clerics, religious figures, rabbis. And or there were people who, they may have been rabbis, they might not have been rabbis, but they had the favor of a king or of a lord, and they served in some advisory capacity. So they were courtiers. Many of those people, and not only in modern history, but going back even further, were financially successful. They had made money as, well, they could have been in one form or another of banking or of trade. And they provide for the lord or the duke or the prince or the king who needs money or some sort of material for military ventures. In other words, Jewish leadership is very different than from the leadership of those people who live in states or empires. It's basically a kind of secondary leadership of rabbis, courtiers, financiers, and merchants. In modern times, we see this quite clearly in that there are Jewish leaders, that is, people who become leaders who happen to be Jewish. But then there are Jewish leaders, that is, people who become leaders in the Jewish community. Well, a lot of them are rabbis, but we do get more and more people whose claim on Jewish leadership comes from a combination of wealth and access. So if someone is a very successful banker, for example, and has some connections, let's say, with people in high places in government, well, that's not all that different from a traditional form of Jewish leadership, even in the Middle Ages. So someone like the financier Jacob Schiff in the United States, who was a very important leader in Jewish philanthropic causes, he was a man of great influence in the United States, economic influence in the United States. Or we have the second wealthiest man in 19th century, Jewish man in 19th century Britain, Moses Montefiore. He makes a lot of money as a financier, and what does he do with the money? He spends it on Jewish philanthropy and advocating for Jewish causes. So this is really a kind of traditional form of Jewish leadership in a 19th century guise. Now, there are exceptions. For example, Adolphe Crémieux, I managed to misspell his name, there's an I in there. Adolphe Crémieux was himself a major figure in French politics. He was the Minister of Justice in the mid-19th century, but he also was a committed leader of French Jewry. So you do get people who have one foot in both worlds. But then you have Jews who simply have no interest in being Jewish leaders. They want to lead a cause, often a left-wing cause. So you have one of the founders of social democracy, Ferdinand Lassalle, who's of Jewish origin, but he doesn't observe as a Jew. He doesn't really identify as a Jew. Or most famously, Leon Trotsky, important figure in the Russian Revolution, commander of the Red Army during the Russian Civil War. These people are leaders, and they're Jews, but they're not Jewish leaders. So we really have, even in the modern era then, still more or less a very traditional form of leadership. The term that was used in Yiddish to describe these kinds of leaders was shtadlonim or shtadlonis, or in Hebrew, shtadlanut, people whose power comes from being intermediaries between Jewish communities and the people who have the real power, political power. So this is the nature of Jewish leadership. Even in our own day, for example, in the United States, you have people who have some kind of success, and they translate that success into positions of leadership in a Jewish community, but they are not outside of the state of Israel. They're not exercising sovereign power. And this is where this young man comes in. Here's a picture of young Theodor Herzl around the time of his bar mitzvah, although we're not even sure if he had a bar mitzvah. There was a cholera epidemic in Budapest, where he grew up. There was a cholera epidemic at the time, and it appears that he actually did not have a bar mitzvah ceremony, but rather a small family event. In any case, here he is as a young man, rather unassuming, and yet this man became a new kind of Jewish leader. And what I want to explain tonight is that what made Herzl so great is that he became a political leader of the sort that was rising throughout the world at the time, not so much leaders of states, but leaders of national movements, of people who were stateless, people who were oppressed, people who were colonized. And Herzl became a leader of that sort. It's revolutionary in Jewish history. It's completely revolutionary. Let's just stop. Regina, you can hear me okay? And okay. So the individual in history, I wrote a biography. And when I went to graduate school, 1980s, biography was definitely out as a subject of historical inquiry, because that was sort of the heyday of social history and various forms of newer cultural history that emphasized popular culture, and a certain disdain for the notion that history should be boiled down to the work of great individuals, which historically usually meant great men. It was a very homocentric, male-centered discipline. But the fact is that in the field of history, I think biography is coming back. You think of all the important biographies that have been written in recent years about American political figures that have sold phenomenally well, written by authors of great scholarly integrity. Some biographies of whether it's, well, just to make one, a certain Alexander Hamilton. Although Ron Chernow himself is not a scholar, he's a wonderful researcher and writer. And I think there's an interest in the United States in the individual in history, Alexander Hamilton, John Adams, all the way up to recent biographies of Malcolm X, Lyndon Baines Johnson, John F. Kennedy, and so on. In the field of international relations, where I spent several years teaching at Oxford, there is actually room once again for the individual, particularly for the elite leader. So I don't discount the importance of social history. I don't discount the importance of aggregates of large numbers of people and social forces. But ultimately, we do have to look at great individuals. I don't want to get into the current political situation in the United States. I will simply say that regardless of what you may feel about the current American president, he has made his influence felt. There is something to be said for the power of the individual, particularly when that leadership assumes the form of a charismatic leader. And this is also one of the major themes in my book. It's not just Herzl was a leader, and it's not just that he was a Jewish leader. He was a charismatic leader. Now, the word charisma, all too often in our own era, is associated with being a celebrity, being charming, being sexy, sex appeal or something. But there's a lot more to charisma than being those things. Max Weber, the great German sociologist who pioneered the concept of charisma in his famous work, Politik als Beruf, Politics as a Vocation, 1919, writes about a charismatic leader being an individual who has no institutional base in authority. They don't come from a landed family necessarily. They don't have political power. They rise up to power because of the force of their personality. And they come to power at a moment when traditional forms of power are breaking down, when society is in crisis, people are looking for new leadership, and up rises the charismatic leadership, who is possessed of a special kind of, well, charisma, from the Greek word charis, which means grace. In Hebrew, we would say chen. So the charismatic then, in the Weberian sense, would be like a biblical hero. The judges in the Hebrew Bible who rise up during the time of the Philistine invasions, they lead and then they disappear. Weber himself was very interested in modern charisma that he associated with people like Theodore Roosevelt, people who would electrify a nation and reform its politics. So charisma then is something deeper than just, being good looking. And for Herzl, he really is the quintessential charismatic leader, because he rises to his fame in the 1890s at a time when European Jewry is in crisis. Violence, persecution against Jews in Russia and Romania, poverty throughout the Pale of Settlement and in other parts of Europe. This is a crisis, and the traditional forms of authority aren't working. Jews are secularizing, or they're losing respect for their rabbis or for rabbinic culture. They've lost faith in the state, or at least many have lost faith in state authorities, certainly in the Russian Empire. Things are crumbling. People are looking for new forms of leadership, and here is this man. And look at him. I suppose that a charismatic leader could be unattractive. but it helps to be good looking. And in the case of Herzl, it's not just that he was good looking, it's how he was good looking. Herzl was often described by contemporaries as a tall man who towered over people because of his greatness. He was actually about 5'8". He wasn't that tall. He was a couple of inches taller than average for that time. People were short back then. So I'm 6'1", 6'2" on a good day. So I'm taller than most American men, but I'm not like a giant or anything. So Herzl was sort of like a 6-footer, something like that, the equivalent today. That wasn't really what mattered. What mattered was, well, people, of course, noticed the beard, which was luxuriant and got more so with age, and people described it as an Assyrian beard. He had a very attractive face. He had a good speaking voice. He had a baritone voice. Unfortunately, there are no recordings of Herzl's voice that have survived, which is too bad. But the thing people notice more than anything else are the eyes. Contemporaries who meet Herzl for the first time are simply captivated by his eyes. They describe them as pools, deep, dark pools that seem to reflect the suffering of the Jewish people, his compassion for the Jewish people, and his deep wisdom. So he is a gorgeous man. He's a beautiful man. He carries himself well. So there's a combination of things that make him charismatic. What ultimately matters is not the fact that he's good looking or has a beard or has deep set eyes. It's the fact that he has a message to offer that people want to hear at a time when other forms of power are collapsing. So the aesthetic aspects of his charisma are important, but they really don't explain everything. Because what made Herzl so amazing was not just that he was a charismatic. It's that he actually knew how to get things done. He had a work ethic, a prodigious work ethic. He would work 14, 16 hours a day. Overwork killed him. He died at the age of 44 of a heart ailment. We're not sure exactly what it was. My theory is that he either was born with or acquired a heart murmur. He may have had rheumatic fever as a child. It's just a guess. But he was rejected from the military twice. He failed his military physical. And since there was nothing externally wrong with him, overwhelmingly, when people were rejected for the military and there was nothing physically wrong with them, it was because of a heart murmur. And he was diagnosed with a heart condition, myocarditis, at the age of 35, I think. And he was told by his doctor to slow down, but Herzl didn't know how to slow down. He was a workaholic, and he died at 44, really overwork and an overstrained heart. He may have had lupus. He may have developed lupus in his early 30s. I'm actually in correspondence with a cardiologist, a professor of cardiology, who's just fascinated with this, and I've sent him all my documents and stuff, so we'll see what he comes up with. But the point is that despite his physical frailty, and I'll talk more about that in a second, he not only knew how to work, he knew how to get things done. He had begun life as a lawyer. He didn't last at that very long. Then he tried his hand at playwriting, and his plays weren't that bad. I mean, they were okay. They weren't great, but he did have several of them produced in major venues. But the important thing was the work ethic. And then he got a job in 1891. He got his plum job as not just a journalist, but one of the most important journalists in Europe. He was the Paris correspondent to a newspaper based in Vienna called the Neue Freie Presse, the most prestigious newspaper in the German-speaking world, and he was its Paris correspondent. He worked indefatigably, and he built up a real ability to discipline himself in terms of the use of time, and even more so when he went back to Vienna 4 years later to become the newspaper's literary editor. The same work ethic and efficiency that he brought to his work, he brought to Zionism. So Herzl becomes a Zionist. He hasn't even heard the word Zionism when he becomes a Zionist. He's undergoing a series of personal crises in the mid-1890s. He's not sure about antisemitism in Europe and how it affects him and other Jews. he seems to be rattled by anti-Semitism to the point that it drives him into a state of frenzy or mania. And he underwent a period in 1895 where he barely slept for weeks. He wrote continuously, and out of that explosion of writing came texts that eventually got boiled down into the pamphlet that some of you have read for Professor Pat's class, The Jewish State. Herzl then devoted himself to something that no one had really thought about doing, creating an international, organized Zionist movement that would begin with a parliamentary body known as a Zionist Congress meeting, and then planning the means by which Jews might acquire a homeland, although at that time he wasn't quite sure if it would be in Palestine or some other part of the world. Now, he wasn't the first Zionist. Zionism goes back to the 1880s. There was a Zionist organization known as the Lovers of Zion, Hovevei Tzion in Hebrew, that went back to 1884. But this was very small. They didn't have much money. Their accomplishments were meager. Herzl had much bigger plans. He wanted to create a kind of global Jewish parliament, and he wanted to go directly to the world's most powerful individuals to obtain great power legitimization for mass Jewish settlement in a territory. And pretty quickly he decides that it has to be Palestine. This is audacious, to say the least. But the amazing thing is that he was able to accomplish at least some of it. The world's full of dreamers. What makes Herzl so fascinating is what he was able to do. He convened the Congress in 1897 with 200 delegates. And every year it grew after that until the time of his death in 1904. He founded a global Zionist organization at the same time as the Zionist Congress. Then he oversaw the founding of a Zionist bank. And he was influential in the founding of what would become a fund to purchase land in Palestine. He oversaw all of this. And as the Zionist movement grew, and as the Zionist Congress became more and more like a parliament of a government in the waiting, it developed political parties, an Orthodox Jewish political party known as Mizrahi, and then a secular and cultural Zionist group known as the Democratic Faction. Herzl wasn't really happy about either of these because they spent a lot of time criticizing him, but he oversaw it and he allowed it to happen. So under his watch, and I'm not saying he did it all by himself, he had friends and allies, but he oversaw the construction of a global Zionist movement. At the time of his death, there were 100,000 Jews worldwide who belonged to the Zionist organization. At the time that he became a Zionist, there were 15,000 Jews worldwide in the Lovers of Zion federations. So Herzl increased the number of, as it were, card-carrying Zionists in the world by a factor of 7. So he accomplished a lot. So when I talk about Jewish leadership, yes, he was a charismatic leader, but he was also able to get things done. Now, how was he able to get things done aside from a work ethic? I've talked about Herzl being a good-looking guy. He was also someone who knew, who understood as a playwright, as a man with an artistic sense. He knew that leadership requires a certain amount of self-fashioning. You have to present yourself to the people in such a way that you are what they want you to be. That's a very important aspect of charismatic leadership, that you give voice to people. You express the longings and the feelings that they might not have fully articulated, but which they have. Herzl understood this. And in this sense, Herzl shared much in common with great leaders in modern history who fashioned themselves in a certain way. This gentleman here of modest Jewish origins, who fashioned himself to be the descendant from Italian aristocracy, became the Prime Minister of England, Benjamin Disraeli. This gentleman here, familiar, I would imagine, to all of you, paralyzed by polio, and who cultivated an image of insouciance, of laughter, an easygoing manner, the cigarette in the cigarette holder, the grin, the way he would throw back his head, all of this was carefully calculated to really divert attention from the fact that he was in agony much of the time. He was in a great deal of pain. But he cultivated a certain image, and of course an image as well of being compassionate and caring for the American people. And if any of you have not listened to Roosevelt's fireside chats, which are all available on YouTube, his radio broadcasts from the 1930s, he is projecting an image of a kind of consoler-in-chief, an educator and a consoler-in-chief, which is the responsibility of a great president. Earlier, this great president knew how tall he was. He was the tallest president, 6'4", I believe. The stovepipe hat was not just an accoutrement that people wore at the time. He wore it because he knew it made him even taller and kind of added to the majesty and the strikingness of his appearance. So what Herzl did was not so unusual by, for example, growing the luxuriant beard. Or to give another example of scripting, just a second, I'll show that in a second. Actually, other great leaders throughout history have paid great attention to their appearance, how they look to people. This man here, Mahatma Gandhi, was a lawyer, South African lawyer wearing a business suit, who constructed an image of himself as a simple man of the people by wearing homespun later in his middle and later years. Quite the opposite, this gentleman from another very poor family, Muhammad Ali Jinnah, the founder of modern Pakistan, with his suits and his white shoes. This is a man who wanted to look every inch the gentleman. So he constructed an image of himself, and perhaps the greatest example in our recent history in the United States of a man who created a physical image that would be appealing. Martin Luther King Jr., from a heritage of Black preachers who cultivated immaculate dress and an eloquent style of delivery in order to impress not only their own communities, but to gain legitimacy in the eyes of white America. So leadership involves self-fashioning. Now we look and see how Herzl did it. How did he fashion himself and fashion the nation? This is the first meeting of the first Zionist Congress in 1897. It's in the afternoon. I think it was, it was 11 a.m. And he's told everybody that they have to wear evening dress. I've read books that say that it was August and it was incredibly hot, and so the delegates who were not used to wearing evening dress were uncomfortable. I actually looked up the weather in Basel on August 29th or whatever it was, 1897. It was about 23 degrees or something Celsius. It was, in the 70s. It was very nice. But he scripted it because, and now there's lots of photographs and images of this, the dignity of the occasion. And he applied that as well to his own life story. In 1899, Herzl wrote an essay about himself in which he wrote that when he was a journalist, he covered the Dreyfus affair, the arrest of Captain Alfred Dreyfus, who was framed on charges of espionage. Herzl wrote that this injustice drove him to become a Zionist. But this isn't really true. Herzl covered the Dreyfus affair. He never wrote anything in his public writings at the time that suggested he was convinced of Dreyfus's innocence. And in French, when he wrote of Dreyfus's public degradation in 95, he writes that the mob shouted, "Mort au traître, mort au Judas," death to the Judas, death to the traitor. The Hebrew translation of that essay years later changed it to Mavet leYehudim, mort aux Juifs. That's not in Herzl's writing in German or in French. I checked every French newspaper, and they all reported it being mort au traître, mort au Judas, right? So Herzl claimed that Dreyfus affair made him into a Zionist. Dreyfus doesn't even show up in Herzl's diary until the end of 1896. Now, does this mean that Herzl was lying? I'm not so sure. I'm not so sure that he was lying, because just before the Dreyfus affair began, just before Dreyfus was arrested, Herzl completed a play called The New Ghetto, 3 weeks before Dreyfus's arrest was made public. And this is a play about anti-Semitism, about a man struggling with anti-Semitism and how, as a man seeking honor and dignity, he should deal with it. Herzl was really in quite a state of turmoil at this time. And it may very well be that his memory conflated the two years later, that he associated his state at the time he wrote The New Ghetto with the events of Dreyfus's arrest, trial, and conviction. I don't know. I simply don't have an answer. But it is true that there's a certain amount of projection there. And he fashioned, whether intentionally or not, he fashioned himself as a product of world history. The Dreyfus affair, the greatest political scandal of his era. He projected Zionism right back into it, even though that's not really what made him into a Zionist. And then physically, look how Herzl crafted himself physically. Here he is as a young man. Nice looking. Looks very contemporary, right? You could just imagine him walking down the streets of New York or Chicago or something. Now look at him just a few years later. It's not just that he's gotten older. The hair is the same. It's the beard. And look how he's grown it out. He's aware of it, the way he stands and looks at the camera. And one of the most famous images of Herzl is a great example of self-fashioning. The photograph by E.M. Lillian of Herzl overlooking the Rhine from his room at the Three Kings Hotel in Basel, Switzerland. A profile view, you see his sadness in his eyes, the depth of his wisdom. I'm not saying there's anything wrong with this. This is simply political visual discourse. This is how politicians get their message across. It's a form of self-fashioning. Now, a charismatic leader can reach his or her public in two different ways. One is by being friendly, outgoing, the kind of person who makes you feel like the most important person they've ever met. If there's anybody here who's met Bill Clinton, I've been told he had this capacity, that he would talk to you and look at you, and he would make you feel like you're the most important person in the world. This man had that ability. Charles Parnell, an early Irish nationalist, had that ability, as did Edvard Beneš and Jan Masaryk. These were pioneer figures in Czech nationalism in the early 20th century. And believe it or not, the authoritarian ruler of Poland in the 1920s, Josef Pilsudski, had a real common touch. The other kind of charismatic leadership is the kind where you look at the leader from afar and you venerate them. Herzl was that second type of leader, and it was very, very effective. Oops. Now, Herzl then had organizational power, he had charismatic power, and he had a lot of jealous Zionist colleagues who wished they had had that kind of charisma because they all thought they could have led the Zionist organization better than he. Now, this rather good-looking man, Menachem Ussishkin, who became the director of the Jewish National Fund, he hated Herzl. He thought that Herzl was wasting his time gallivanting around the world trying to get great power permission for a Jewish home in Palestine. He absolutely loathed Herzl. He respected him. Ussishkin was never able to rise to a position greater than that of directing the Jewish National Fund. He certainly knew how to get things done. He did not have Herzl's glamorous base as a upper middle class Viennese Jew, a journalist, by the way, the most highly paid and most respected journalist in his newspaper, the Neue Freie Presse. Ussishkin was just a Jew in Odessa. He didn't have the kind of cred and the kind of clout that Herzl exerted, let alone his charisma. And then you have this man, Herzl's most trenchant critic, and frankly, a man who was a lot smarter than Herzl, Asher Ginsburg, otherwise known as Ahad Ha'am, a man who was quintessentially capable of criticizing anything that Herzl came up with and very incapable of coming up with anything on his own. Sami Gronemann, who was a great German Zionist humorist, once said that if Ahad Ha'am beheld Achilles, he would only see his heel. And I mention this because Ahad Ha'am has developed a kind of a cult status that I don't quite understand. I mean, he was an extremely intelligent man. He was able to criticize the obvious failings in Herzl's strategies to win great power approval for Zionism. He proposed things that at the time were considered, I think, quite admirable in the Zionist movement: revival of the Hebrew language, strengthening of Hebrew culture. He was not alone, though. There were other Zionists at his time who were saying the exact same thing and in the same way. So how do we account for this? I think Ahad Ha'am had a charisma of his own. but it was a different kind of charisma. If any of you here, either the older people or the students, if you've ever had a professor who you just absolutely adore, you get professors who have a small cult following. They could never be political leaders. They could never run a political party. They could never run a country. But in their little world of the university, they're God. I think Ahad Am was that kind of charismatic. He had a coterie of Eastern European Jews from whom he had come. He was wise, he was smart, he was stringent, he was spare. They looked up to him. He became, as it were, their rabbi. Although he himself had been raised in a Hasidic background, he had gone mostly secular. I know that he smoked on the Sabbath, but he was kind of a secular rabbi. And he had a charisma of his own, but it could not lead him to greatness in the Zionist movement. And he knew that. He never sought that kind of leadership. He would just snip at Herzl from the sides. And then saddest of all is a man you probably haven't heard of. Here's a man who wanted to be Herzl. He tried to grow a Herzl beard. He tried to slick his hair back the same way. His name was Natan Birnbaum. He was actually the man who invented the word Zionism. He invented it in 1890. He was a Viennese Jew of Galician origin, very intelligent, and a Zionist activist who was an early supporter of Herzl, worked for Herzl, and then became very jealous of Herzl. And he eventually left Zionism behind, and he became an Orthodox Jew, devoted himself to learning Yiddish, and became an early founder of what became known in 1912 as the Agudat Yisrael, ultra-Orthodox political party. So he left Zionism behind. So you see that Herzl had rivals, a man with no charisma, a man with a lot of charisma, but the wrong kind, and a man with, I would say, modest charisma. Herzl had abilities that these people did not have. You know who did have charisma? Herzl's nemesis. The mayor of Vienna at the time that Herzl became a Zionist, Karl Lueger, who was known in German as der schöne Karl, the beautiful Karl. He was a good-looking man too. To me, he looks a little bit like Seth Rogen. But this man was not Jewish. And he was an out-and-out anti-Semite. He was a demagogue of the worst sort, and his political party was overtly anti-Semitic. This was a man with charisma. He was enormously popular in Vienna. So Herzl's one kind of charismatic. This is the other kind. I mentioned earlier frailty. One of the most interesting things about charismatic leaders is that they project energy, a kind of burning energy. And to me, it makes me think of a star that's burning up its energy as fast as it can, and then it burns out. FDR, I mentioned, paralyzed by polio as a child, put under enormous strain during the Second World War. His blood pressure was out of control. I think it was like 290 over something at the time, shortly before his death, and he had a cerebral hemorrhage and died in 1945. He was fragile, but he was determined to overcome that fragility, and even more so, John F. Kennedy, who was a man hobbled by many physical illnesses. He had an adrenal gland problem. He had to have some kind of procedure. I forget if it was a kidney procedure on his back that left a huge gaping hole in his back, I think, in the late 1950s. He almost died several times when he was in the 1950s, and even I think he had a medical crisis in 1961. Was it right around the time of the Bay of Pigs? He was an ill man, but he projected health. And you see videos of him. He just projects it. This is something about a charismatic, that they project it, and yet they can be quite frail. They can also be mentally frail. Gandhi attempted suicide when he was young. It may not have been a serious attempt, but he had depression. Martin Luther King had terrible depression, and I think he did seriously attempt suicide when he was young. There is a whole literature on the psychiatry of great leaders and how they can be both physically and mentally frail. The best example of this is Winston Churchill. Winston Churchill suffered from terrible depression. He once wrote, "All men are worms, but I am a glowworm." And Herzl himself was a deeply troubled man. It's not just that he had the heart defect. he was also psychologically troubled, and you can see the deep and troubled eyes, which unfortunately his children inherited. All of his children suffered from mental illness. All of them died tragically. Herzl was a frail man. Herzl was a troubled man. Herzl was eager to find a cause, something to hold on to, something that he could devote himself to. And unfortunately, he had a bad marriage. He and his wife did not get along well. Zionism became his salvation, but it also killed him. He devoted himself to it. He burned all of his energy into it, and then he died. But this is a characteristic of many great leaders. And here he is at the age of 43, looking like a man much older. This is the last official portrait before he died. He died at the age of 44. So we've talked about leadership in a comparative way, and I want to move towards the end by talking about the most controversial aspect of Herzl's leadership, and that is his negotiations with world leaders. In the Jewish tradition, Zionist tradition, Herzl is a statesman, a great leader. But to those who criticize Herzl, particularly supporters of the Palestinian cause, Herzl was little more than a lackey trying to do the bidding of England or of France or of Germany in order to win their approval to establish a protectorate over Palestine. Was Herzl a statesman or a lackey? Herzl wanted to steer an independent course for the Jewish people. But it's true that he wanted to deal with the leaders of the great powers, and we'll get to that in just a second. What I want to focus on for now is that Herzl turned first for support to some of the wealthiest Jews in the world, the Rothschild banking family and another wealthy financier, Baron Maurice de Hirsch. They turned him down. Herzl decided that he would create a democratic popular movement to represent the interests of the Jewish people. So in that sense, he's nobody's lackey. He's the head of what would be a democratic organization. But there's a more complicated question here. Herzl travels 5 times to Istanbul. He meets with the Ottoman Sultan, Abdul Hamid. He asks him to grant a charter to authorize mass Jewish settlements in Palestine, and the Sultan's not interested. I mean, he has very little to gain from this. The Ottoman Empire is in debt, and Herzl dangles in front of him notions that Jews have so much money that they could pay down much of the Ottoman debt. Well, this is not true, and I don't think Herzl believed it either. Maybe he did. Maybe he actually believed what the anti-Semites said about Jewish wealth, because even the Rothschilds and even Hirsch could not have done that. But the Ottoman Sultan met with him several times, kind of strung him along to see what Herzl could really come up with, but there was no way on earth that the Ottoman Empire was going to grant a charter for mass Jewish settlement in a territory in the middle of the empire, and not just any territory, but Palestine, a territory that has a special meaning in Arab and Muslim consciousness going back at least to the Middle Ages, and especially Jerusalem, which is a city of great religious sacrality to Muslims the world over. And the Abdul Hamid is the Khalif. He's considered to be the successor of the Prophet, of Muhammad. There's no way on earth he's going to allow Jews to simply take over Palestine. Herzl goes to the British. He goes to the German emperor, and he says, why don't you establish a protectorate over Palestine? He even goes to Palestine in 1898. It's the only time Herzl went to Palestine in his life. He went for 10 days. The only reason he went was because Kaiser Wilhelm was there. And Kaiser Wilhelm said to him, come meet me in Palestine. And Herzl had a couple of brief meetings with him in Palestine, but Kaiser Wilhelm basically met with the Ottoman Sultan afterwards and said, what do you think of this idea? And the Ottoman Sultan said, no. And that was the end of it. So Herzl is, in this sense, chasing the colonial powers of the world, and with no thought at all, really, about the people who live there. Because there are 400,000 or so Arabs living in Palestine at the time. And Herzl had an exchange of letters in 1899 with a former mayor of Jerusalem, who said to him with great courtesy, this is Muhammad Zia al-Khalidi, writes to Herzl with great humility and great courtesy that he respects the Jews and he respects their connection to the land of Israel, and he is sorry for their persecution. He's actually very nice, but he says this land is occupied, and there are 300 million Muslims in the world, which is how many Muslims there were back then, and they're going to be furious if Jews try to take this land. Herzl appears to have been oblivious. He wrote back, "Don't worry, we have no ill intentions towards the Arabs of Palestine. We will give them our scientific technology and our culture and education, and they'll be better off, and they'll have nothing to fear." So it doesn't really register with Herzl that he is acting without considering the collective wants or needs of the people who live in the country. So does this mean that Herzl's leadership is nothing more than that of a colonial want-to-be? Someone who goes to the British, goes to the Germans, says basically, we will be good, loyal colonial subjects if you give us land in Palestine. Well, as I sum up, I think it's a little more complicated than that. Because weak people, colonized peoples, persecuted peoples, look for support where they can get it. You have to have pragmatic means to an idealized goal. You know, the Congress Party in India in 1885 was founded in order to promote Indian autonomy and eventually independence. It took many decades for them to demand independence. It represented Indian, well-educated Indians who often had British educations working with, there were Scottish and English individuals who were in the Congress Party at the very beginning. So you have Indians collaborating with the occupier because they want to move towards a goal. You have in Egypt the Waft Party. Here we have the founder of the Waft, or the leader of the Waft, Saad Zaghloul, who rose from actually very humble circumstances. He became friendly with the English, essentially the English putative, or not putative, but ruler of Egypt. For all intents and purposes, the ruler of Egypt, Lord Cromer. Zaghloul became very friendly with him and worked with him on various schemes for reform of British rule over Egypt that would eventually lead to independence. Now, he worked with the colonial occupier. Herzl had no colonial occupier to work with. He went to the various great powers and said, "What can you do for me?" And he was very ambiguous about his goals. So the term that one of my students once used is constructive ambiguity, in that when he went to the great powers, very much like Parnell, who was an Irish nationalist leader, Parnell did not say, "We want Irish independence and nothing else." He would say home rule, autonomy. You know, some people in his movement wanted independence, some people wanted something less than that. Herzl was like that. Herzl was pragmatic. So he goes to the Ottoman Sultan, "What can you do for me?" He goes to the English colonial secretary, "What can you do for me?" He goes to the German Kaiser, "What can you do for me?" Now, ultimately, he doesn't get anything concrete. He does get an offer from the British colonial secretary in 1903 of territory in the British Empire, but it's not in Palestine. It's in British East Africa, in what is today Kenya, along the Uganda Railway. And for some reason, it's called Uganda in Zionist historiography, but it was not Uganda, or the country what became the country of Uganda. And Herzl was excited by this, not because he really wanted to establish a Jewish state in Uganda. He didn't. As he wrote to his close colleague Max Nordau, politically, the offer of Uganda is like the founding of the first Zionist colony, Rishon LeZion, in 1882. It's a political triumph. The British have recognized us. They've recognized that we have a claim. Now, what they've offered us is not what we want, but we'll take it for now, and we'll have a settlement there. We'll send some persecuted Jews there. It's not the final goal. It's a means to a goal. And you even see this ambiguity in the program of the Zionist organization in 1897. Herzl himself might have wanted something a little bit stronger, that Zionism seeks statehood. Other people in the Zionist organization were afraid of what such demands might have on the Ottoman emperor. And so there was an agreement to come up with an ambiguous program. Zionism seeks to secure for the Jewish people a publicly recognized, legally assured homeland in Palestine. It could be a lot of things. It could be a province of the Ottoman Empire, right? It could be a state. It could be many things. So rather than see Herzl, as a colonialist pure and simple, he was certainly a product of his time. He believed Western European culture was superior to Middle Eastern culture. He did not take into consideration the collective interests and needs and desires of Palestinian Arabs. I mean, in many ways, he was a product of a colonialist era. There's no question about it. But he was also a pragmatic politician, a leader of a stateless people. And I just want to end with this interesting newspaper article from 1918, 14 years after Herzl's death. So this is before World War I has ended. In Philadelphia, at Independence Hall, of all places, you have a gathering of stateless European people's leaders calling upon the United States after the war to recognize these people's claims. You've got here representatives from Yugoslavs, that is Southern Slavs, Poles, Czechs, Ruthenians, Ukrainians, Greeks, Lithuanians, Albanians, and the very last one, Zionists, are invited to be part of this demand to the world. We are stateless peoples. Grant us what we deserve. And by the way, who is the Zionist representative? Itamar ben Avi. Itamar ben Avi was the son of Eliezer ben Yehuda, the founder of the modern Hebrew. So I think there's a lot of interesting things here. Now, is there time for me to show a short film, or should we move to questions? The film's about 8 minutes long.
Maybe we'll just show a clip from the...
That I wouldn't know how to do. I usually show the whole thing, but if we could move to questions, and if there's time, I could show it, or I can send people the link. I just wanted to talk about how great leaders are mythologized, and this is a film made around 1920.
Let me share a little bit of the film.
So, I mean, I love it.
Go ahead. I think people would like to see the film.
I think so too.
Let me know if, hold on. It's a silent film, but do you hear music?
Mm-hmm. Yes.
And that is that.
Very good. Well, thank you so much, Derek Penslar, for a wonderful lecture, wonderful presentation, for sharing these materials. We've had some questions come in, and I'll just remind those of you who, if you do have questions for Professor Penslar, to ask questions either through the chat or the Q&A. So if you'll stay with us for a few more minutes, we'd love to ask you a few questions that have come through.
Of course.
So I'll start, and Regina, if you see questions that have come in, please feel free to jump in. So one question that came in, and you allude to this in the beginning when you talk about Herzl's sort of charismatic leadership, but also as somebody who is deeply troubled in a lot of ways. And so there's a specific question that asks, and I think you referenced this in the beginning of your biography, which I'll just hold up so that people can see. This is a wonderful biography for those of you who want to read more about Theodor Herzl, the charismatic leader, part of the Yale University Press series of Jewish lives. But you mentioned in the beginning of the book that you don't want to delve too deeply into sort of psychological analysis or, retrospectively. But there's a question that came in about, would you think about, was he somebody who was suffering from bipolar disorder, and these sort of cycles that he was dealing with, and somebody who's remarkably creative, going through, as you refer to, sort of a manic phases, remarkably productive. I mean, what are we to make of this sort of these aspects of his personality, and do you think this contributed to his ability to accomplish so much in such a short period of time?
Yeah, it's a really good question. When I was working on the book, I was cautious because I know that retrospective diagnosis is not really considered clinically appropriate. And also, the way that people experienced reality, 130 years ago, Herzl lived in a world where you could be eccentric in a way that might be different today. I think that today, if someone with Herzl's behavior were to present himself, he'd be, diagnosed and medicated. But in his world, that the kind of exuberance that he displayed, the kind of enthusiasm, but also the kind of, they wouldn't use the word depression, they would use the word melancholy or akidia or something. It wasn't all that unusual. So, the question is, do we use the standards and the diagnoses and the medical terminology from 2020 to somebody living in the 1890s? What I write about in the book is that I think that from today's perspective, we would probably say that he was bipolar. But I'm cautious about that. And I had friends who are psychotherapists, read the book. I had an MD psychiatrist read the book and a friend who's a therapist. I don't want to say anything definitive that I can't really defend. What I can do is I quote from Herzl himself. I mean, he was clearly very depressed much of the time. I mean, sad. He wasn't depressed in the sort that he couldn't get out of bed, but he was a sad human being who would have these moments of exhilaration. Now, that exhilaration, there's a term for it that is not mania. It's something short of mania. What's it called? Hyperthemia, I think, or hypothemia. And this is something which a scholar named Nasir Gaemi, who's an MD and a psychiatrist, he writes about this, that a lot of political leaders have some levels of depression. Again, not the kind that debilitates you and makes you can't get out of bed, but it makes you sad. And a certain level of subclinical mania, enthusiasm, exuberance. And that's what gives you that kind of burning energy and the charismatic appeal that you have to people. And Herzl did appear to have that. What concerned me about calling him a manic depressive is, so far as I know, he had only one documented manic episode, which was in June of 1895 for several weeks. So I was giving a talk about this in London one night, and a psychiatrist in the audience said, well, actually, if there's one diagnosed, really clear manic episode, that's enough for a clinical diagnosis. Well, but again, I'm not a clinician. That's not my job. So let's just say he was troubled. He was a bit famished. He was troubled. He documented his own sadness. He documented his own exuberance. And I sort of would leave it at that. and that political leaders, great leaders, often have these kind of minor, I would say, manageable levels of what Guyemi calls first-rate madness. He calls it in this book. So I don't have a definitive answer, but that's at least the kind of feeling that I went with as I wrote the book.
Thank you. There's a good number of really excellent questions coming in, so I'm gonna try to
Sure.
fold those that I can together to make sure that we get to as many as possible. So there are two questions that ask about Herzl's charisma. One comes from Professor Jeremy Pressman, who you may know, a colleague of mine at the University of Connecticut, who has a new book that's recently come out on this called "The Sword Is Not Enough," and he'll be speaking later this semester on that book. So Jeremy asks, do you see Herzl's charisma and organizational success as one and the same, or did the charisma contribute to his ability to build institutions? And I'll add to that question a question that came in from one of my students who asks also about Herzl's charisma. How did that communicate to the common person? How did he convey, how did Herzl portray his message to the common person? How much did common people know of Herzl? So maybe both directions of his charisma, both in institution building and in how it communicated to the common person.
Well, I think in terms of delegation of authority and trying to get people to do things, obviously the charismatic has persuasive power. Herzl was eloquent, and the charisma, he had an effect on people who would otherwise have been opposed to him. So, for example, there was a Zionist leader named Nachum Sokolov, who was a Polish-Jewish journalist and later became an important Zionist diplomat and president of the Zionist organization. So when Herzl first began writing, when he wrote Der Judenstaat, the Jewish state, Nachum Sokolov, who was editing a Hebrew newspaper in Warsaw, wrote, this is nonsense. It's a crazy idea. It'll just piss off the Ottoman Empire, and the Russian Tsar will think that we're all revolutionaries. It's a terrible idea. Anyway, he goes to the first Zionist Congress and he meets Herzl, and he's absolutely floored. He's simply flummoxed, and he falls in love, as it were. So, yes, the charisma makes it possible to get people to do what you want them to do. And Herzl did have great persuasive power. So in 1897, as he's organizing the first Zionist Congress, he's dealing with all these different little factions of Jews who disagree and have their petty differences. And Herzl prevails upon them, and I'm sure the charisma helped. The second question about the common man, this is actually very interesting. Although Herzl's voice was not broadcast and there was no television then, there were newspapers, and Herzl's image was disseminated throughout the world. And the image was a beautiful image. And so in that sense, the charisma was reproduced, like the mechanical, what's it called, the work of art in the era of mechanical reproduction or something. It was a mechanical reproduction of his charisma, his aura, as it were, was communicated to the masses. So much so that when he died, I mean, the streets of Vienna, I don't know how many thousands and thousands of people came to Vienna for his funeral from all over the empire, from all over Europe. They just came streaming in. So this was a mass movement. It doesn't mean that every Jew was a Zionist. You know, their 100,000 Jews is not 14, 15 million Jews. But still, no, he did communicate his charisma to the masses. It was through his image and also through his text. And this is a very interesting thing about Herzl. Sometimes you can be more emotionally persuasive by holding back, by being restrained. So at Zionist congresses, he had a colleague named Max Nordau who was kind of over the top, and he would declaim. Herzl didn't. So those of you who have read The Jewish State know this. The writing is very spare and very unemotional. And he says, I'm just looking at anti-Semitism, you know, from an objective point of view. And it's very cool. But underneath it, it's burning passion, compassion, fear, anxiety. And what's interesting is that Max Nordau, his friend Max Nordau, caught it. He figured it out. When he read Der Judenstaat, he wrote a letter to Herzl. And he said, you know, this is a deeply powerful, emotionally powerful book or pamphlet, precisely because of your understatement, this kind of icy cold that you put on top of it, but the energy is there underneath. So the charisma did get communicated to the masses.
So we've had a number of questions that have come in that are really interesting, and I want to try to get to as many as possible. There are a couple of questions related to, so one specifically thinking about the broader spectrum of Jewish politics at the time, and this one comes from Alan Berkowitz, who asks if your research uncovers if Herzl engaged with Jewish groups that were in opposition to Zionism, such as the Jewish Labor Bund or other diaspora nationalists. And I'm going to piggyback a little bit on that question because in the Jewish state, and as you talked about in your talk, what Herzl is above and all concerned with is the problem of anti-Semitism. And he writes very clearly, that once everybody hears about his idea and hears about his plan, the problem of anti-Semitism, will cease at once and forever. And so I'm just wondering if you can talk about sort of his diagnosing of what he sees as the number one problem that faces the Jewish people from within the political spectrum of Jewish political parties at the time, as a economic problem versus a cultural problem that maybe a Hara'am was thinking of versus the problem of anti-Semitism or, what the Jewish Labor Bund was talking about at the time.
Well, it's funny. I would be a little contrarian, although of course Herzl's concerned about anti-Semitism, and it's how he starts Der Judenstaat. I think that for Herzl, there's actually two issues. For Eastern European Jewry, Russia, Romania, it is an issue of anti-Semitism and persecution, poverty as well. But there's another issue that's just as important for him, for Western Jews, for Austrian German Jews, and that's dignity. Herzl is a man who feels that his honor and his dignity have been slighted because of anti-Semitism. This is not the anti-Semitism that kills, it's the anti-Semitism that demeans, that degrades, and it really ate at him. And for him, the project of the Jewish state is about not only sending Jews to a safe place, it's about restoring Jewish dignity. And he believes, rather naively, that once this project has been implemented and Jews have moved to the Jewish state, those Jews who choose not to, and because he does not imagine all Jews moving, will be free to live as they wish, because the world will respect and honor the Jewish people for having created the state, and therefore there will be no more anti-Semitism. So on that, he wasn't quite right. What's interesting is that Herzl fought battles against certain non-Zionist groups and not others. Herzl fought battles against assimilationists because those are the people he actually dealt with. When he walked into the opera house in Vienna and people in the audience started catcalling him, King of the Jews. Those were like assimilationist Jews who thought that Zionism was, either ridiculous or dangerous or both. He dealt with Orthodox Jews who opposed Zionism. What he didn't really deal with was the Bund. I don't know of exchanges, letters that he exchanged with activists in the Bund. He and Dubnow did not have a relationship. He had no interest in the concept of diaspora nationalism. The thing to keep in mind about Herzl is that not only was he not a Judaically literate man, he was not really even au courant with what was happening in his own world. So for example, when he decides that the Jews should have a state, he'd never even heard of the Chovevei Zion, the lovers of Zion. He had never heard of Pinsker, Lev Pinsker, who writes a pamphlet called Auto-Emancipation in 1881 that is in many ways very similar to Herzl's pamphlet. Herzl's never heard of any of these people. So it's amazing how little he knew because he's an acculturated Jew living in Vienna. And so he actually did not engage directly with, he didn't engage directly with a lot of the currents within Russian Jewish politics at the time.
And ironically, maybe not being caught up in some of those debates. I mean, I'm sure it bothered people like a Hara'am, right? The lack of knowledge that he actually had, but maybe it helped him in the long run to not get bogged down in those internecine debates.
Absolutely. No, Hara'am was furious about Herzl's, his amartsut, his ignorance. It just drove him nuts. But Herzl was, what does they say, fools rush in where angels fear to tread. And Herzl wasn't a fool. But he did have the benefit of ignorance, and he just blustered his way through and was able to accomplish things. And even ultra-Orthodox Jews understood this. I forget which Breuer it was, but one of the leaders in what would become the Agudat Yisrael wrote after Herzl died that only an assimilated Jew would even dare do this. It's so outrageous. And even though he wasn't a Zionist, he did admire Herzl for it.
Are you good to take 2 more questions? Yes? Okay. So I'm going to try to pull together a couple of the questions, and both of them have to do with sort of longer term problems that the Jewish state has been forced to deal with. And I wonder to what extent is it fair to lay these at the feet of Herzl? So one of them comes from Christopher Bradley, who asks about sort of his, Herzl's viewing Western European culture as superior. You referenced his interactions with prominent Arabs living in Jerusalem and sort of dismissing the concerns of the Muslim world. Ahad Ha'am also raised these concerns about like being aware of that there is a large population that lives on the land, and Herzl wasn't really worried about that. So I think the first question, if I can ask this as a 2-part, is do we see Herzl as being responsible in any way for the conflict that developed? That's Christopher's question. By having a lack of foresight or not taking seriously the sort of the people who already live there, the large numbers of people who already live there. And the second part, which I'll piggyback onto that, is this Jewish state versus state of Jews debate. To what extent does Herzl's sort of kicking the can down or punting on this question of what type of a state will it be? How Jewish will the state be? Let's figure those out later. Let's build it, and then we'll figure out what the foundation of it should be. To what extent does that, provide a preview to the conflicts that exist to the present day, right? Is this a state run according to secular law? Is this a state run according to Jewish law? What's the interaction between the two? So is it fair to sort of lay any blame at Herzl's feet for some of the problems that exist today, both in terms of the conflict with the Palestinians and the secular religious divide that exists in the state?
No, those are great questions. Herzl's whole productive Zionist life was about the same as the lifespan of the Beatles as a group, less than a decade. And he accomplished so much, and yet he dies in 1904. And all he's done, and it's enough, okay, he's established a framework, he's put Zionism onto the world stage, but that's it. So the fact is that everything else is up to his successors. Let's say Herzl had gone in 1898 to Palestine, and he'd written in his diary, oh, wait, there are all these Arabs. What are we going to do? Maybe we should just give up on the whole thing. Or we're going to have to get their permission. I can't really imagine that even if Herzl had been more self-aware, aware, compassionate, if he'd respected the Palestinians more, which I think many of us would have liked to see that, but I don't know how it would really change his policies of what he's trying to attain. And this is something that we see with Chaim Weizmann, who I think in many ways was a much more perceptive politician than Herzl. I mean, when Chaim Weizmann is negotiating for what becomes the Balfour Declaration, he's thinking about the needs of the Jewish people. And in the post-World War I negotiations, he's thinking about the needs of the Jewish people. And he makes an agreement with the ruler of the short-lived Arab kingdom in Damascus, Faisal ibn Hussein, but he's not talking to the Palestinians either, Chaim Weizmann. So at what point do Zionists begin to really deal seriously with Palestinian opposition? Well, some Zionists do it from the beginning. Ahad Ha'am, you mentioned, right? He writes about it. Yitzhak Epstein, famous essay of 1907, Ashelah Ne'elemet, he writes about the opposition from Palestinians. But I really think it's only in the 1920s, 1930s, when you have a larger Jewish community in Palestine, substantial Jewish immigration, and then you have the Zionist leaders on the ground. So whether it's Ben Gurion or in the opposite camp until he's unable to stay in the country, Jabotinsky, they're talking about this, saying, what are we going to do? And here I defer to a whole body of scholarship that's been created in the last 10 years that shows that Zionists in the 20s and 30s were experimenting with lots of different options other than full-blown statehood, because they were very aware of Arab opposition to Zionism, and they were thinking, how are we going to deal with this? So I wouldn't blame Herzl for that. I think it's one thing to be critical of Herzl for being a early 20th century Western European who believes in European cultural superiority and who does not respect, again, Palestinians as individuals or as a collective. Yeah, we can be critical of him for that. But I don't think we can blame him for then events from the 1920s, 30s, 40s, let alone, more recently. The second question, I actually think Herzl had a very clear prescription about what the Jewish state should be. It's very clear, whether we like it or not. Some of it's in his Jewish state, some of it's in his novel Old New Land from 1902. He envisions a future Jewish homeland in which religion is a matter of personal choice. The temple has been rebuilt, but it is more like an Austrian cathedral. You go if you want, you don't go if you want. And they don't conduct animal sacrifice, they just have prayers. It's a country in which people speak many languages. He himself was not against Hebrew, and he, as some of you know, the Jewish state was translated into Hebrew very quickly afterwards. He was not an opponent of Hebrew, but it didn't capture his heart. So he envisioned a cosmopolitan country of people speaking many languages, with varying approaches to religiosity. And he even writes explicitly, I think it's in the Jewish state, that the rabbis will stay in their synagogues and the military will stay in its barracks. So he wants a kind of idealized, liberal, frankly, a country that's more liberal and more secular than any European state at the time. So it's like he wants to create the best of Europe with none of the bad qualities. So I think he has a very clear view of what the Jewish state should be. Now, whether there was a chance on earth that it could be like that is a different question.
Wonderful. Well, I think this has been really a fantastic program, and we're so grateful for your time and joining us this evening and taking so many questions. I apologize to those of you that we did not manage to get to your questions, but I will share them with Professor Penslar afterwards.
Please do.
And I will allow Regina to have the last word on behalf of the Greenberg Center, but on behalf of the UConn Center for Judaic Studies and for my students, and we'll be discussing this tomorrow in class. I just want to thank you for your time and for joining us and for writing this wonderful book. Thank you so much.
Thank you for having me.
I certainly would like to echo that and say that you have given us all food for thought. And I too enjoyed your book and am recommending it to lots of people. I think it's very important to look at the person behind the ideas, and that's what you have brought in this book. Not just the ideas, not just the actions, but who was this man? Who was this man? And look at what he was able to do.
I'm glad you liked it. And again, thank you very much for the opportunity to speak to you all tonight.
Thank you very, very much. See you all at the next event.
Okay, please join us on Monday for Yiddish Glory. Thanks, everyone.
Have you had Anna Sternschus